federal judge just nuked Donald Trump's ridiculous criminal cases against James Comey and Letitia James because Trump's prosecutor, Lindsay Halligan, wasn't legally a prosecutor. Not unqualified, not inexperienced, not maybe she shouldn't be in charge of imprisoning her boss's enemies. Like she literally, Corey, wasn't allowed to do the job.
Wow, there's so much wrong with this case. And of course, we've talked about it before, but there's a huge update. And, if I were to pick the things that are most wrong with it, I'd have to go with the destruction of democracy, simply using the power of the federal government to try to imprison your opponents. And we should never lose sight of the fact that that's what's going on. But, that's not how the law works. You can't just sort of say not guilty. There has to be some argument.
Welcome to another episode of The Oath and the Office. I'm John Fugelsang, and I'm not saying Pam Bondi's evil, but Macbeth just broke up with her. Folks, please welcome the star of the pod, Professor Corey Brettschneider, who you might know from his work, I don't know, the political science department at Brown University, possibly his work in the New York Times, CNN, MSNBC, Time Magazine, and of course the book The Oath and the Office, a guide to the Constitution for future presidents. Professor Brettschneider, it's good to see you again.
Thanks, John. It's always such a pleasure. And, every week gives us so many topics here. We'll talk about a judge throwing out these really ridiculous prosecutions of Comey and James. We'll talk about the Oval Office in front of his cronies. So there's so much to get to. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Well, we got to talk about how a federal judge just nuked Donald Trump's ridiculous criminal cases against James Comey and Letitia James because Trump's prosecutor, Lindsay Halligan, wasn't legally a prosecutor. Not unqualified, not inexperienced, not maybe she shouldn't be in charge of imprisoning her boss's enemies. Like she literally, Corey, wasn't allowed to do the job. The judge said all actions flowing from Ms. Halligan's defective appointment must be set aside. Corey, like she's a recalled blender from Costco, defective appointment. Now, break this down for us because Lindsay Halligan is not a federal prosecutor, not even a traffic court prosecutor. She was an insurance lawyer who competed in beauty pageant, and Donald Trump likes her for some reason. That's who Trump sent into a federal grand jury to indict the former FBI director and the sitting attorney general of New York. Let me just begin. What exactly did the court say here and why about Lindsay Halligan literally not being a prosecutor and how there's literally not an indictment against James Comey for that reason?
Wow, there's so much wrong with this case. And of course, we've talked about it before, but there's a huge update. And, if I were to pick the things that are most wrong with it, I'd have to go with the destruction of democracy, simply using the power of the federal government to try to imprison your opponents. And we should never lose sight of the fact that that's what's going on. But, that's not how the law works. You can't just sort of say not guilty. There has to be some argument. And what they've done here, what the defense has done is tee up an issue, which is whether or not the prosecutor, Halligan, is or is not legally appointed. And what we've got now is a ruling saying, no, this is not a legal appointment. So let's get into it. The first thing to just say is that the framers saw the danger of prosecution, and they were very careful about who they were going to allow into these roles. So for most appointments, what's required is not just a nomination by the president, but confirmation by the Senate. Now, there are ways around that. There are interim prosecutors, U.S. attorneys that are allowable, but there's a limit usually of 120 days. And what happened in this case is the 120 days the judge said had expired. And of course, the previous prosecutor, just to get into it, the previous U.S. attorney refused to bring these cases because they were BS. So this Halligan wasn't and could not be confirmed by the Senate. That's important to say because she's so unqualified, as you said, and she's not within this 120 days. So the judge said this is not a prosecutor. It's not a legal appointment, and threw the case out. Now, we'll get into this, but there can be an appeal, and there's a possibility that with a proper prosecutor, the charges could be refiled. But that's where we are. So some good news.
Well, now, Comey, no, though, right? Comey has passed the statute of limitations now. They're too late. They've got to they've got to find some new thing he hasn't done to trap him with, I think. But
Well,
now the
there's a
judge,
question. Sorry to interrupt, but
please, no, please.
they're always, these questions are so thorny, and you would want to think like, oh, just get rid of it. They're ridiculous, but that's not how the law works, unfortunately. So there is an argument for bringing the charges against Comey again, which has to do with what's known as tolling. And so the question is whether or not the delay that's happened as a result of all these legal proceedings extend essentially or toll the statute of limitations. And I don't know what the answer to that is. It might be that the courts would say, okay, we're going to allow these charges to be filed because it's not as strictly met when legal process is underway.
So I know
I
this
don't
is all
want
going
them
to
to
come
say that,
down.
but it could happen.
No, but this is all going to come down to Donald Trump's hate versus his embarrassment and what's going to ultimately win out. I
Right.
acknowledge that. I see the science now. But I mean, the ruling was dismissed without prejudice, which, to my understanding, Professor, means a real prosecutor could refile,
Right.
right? I mean,
Very possible. Yeah.
how big a door does without prejudice keep open?
Well, it means that, yeah, that with a legal prosecutor legally appointed, let's say that somebody is, for instance, nominated by the president for this role and then confirmed by the Senate. Well, then yes, they could refile. Now, here's the real question: are you going to be able to get anybody who has the kind of integrity necessary to get through Senate confirmation, even with a party that are essentially lackeys to the president, that's willing to do that? The previous prosecutor who had this role was like, no way, I'm not putting my reputation on the line by bringing this lawless prosecution. And there is something still about the legal profession. The American Bar Association has taken such a stand against what's happening in favor of the rule of law generally. There's a possibility of disbarment for engaging in this kind of mishegas, for lack of a better word. And,
Hmm.
I think look also at so much of what they had to do to get this indictment through a grand jury. They violated all sorts of constitutional rights, saying, for instance, that just trust us. There are parts of the indictment that you don't want to see. There's reporting now that suggests that there wasn't that they wrongly lied to the grand jury and said that, well, if you don't hear from Comey, then that might be evidence against him. So there's all sorts of problems, to say the least, that are coming out with this prosecution. And I'm not sure that if you had a real prosecutor legally appointed, that person would be willing to bring these charges. I think we'd go right back to where we were before, and that they'd say, no, I'm not going to do it. But yes, there's no legal bar in court from trying again.
I mean, to me, we've seen so many state attorneys general being scared that Trump would retaliate against anybody who crossed him. It almost seems like this decision is going to give a lot of state officials new confidence to push back.
I hope so. I think that every time, I think courage is contagious. And every time you have public officials taking a stand against, and I'll keep using the phrase of this attempted self-coup, this attempt to destroy democracy, to aggrandize the president into a kind of monarch. People who know basic civics, seventh grade civics, know you're not supposed to use prosecution to go after your opponents. And so when you start to see people say the emperor has no clothes, or this is a wannabe authoritarian monarch, that's contagious. And this judge did the right thing here, to my mind. It's not just that this was a horrible, unqualified prosecutor, but the procedures weren't used properly to honor what the framers tried to do, to ensure that people of virtue had these roles so they wouldn't be abused. One thing about it, I'll just say, to zoom out a little bit, which is that we're in the nitty-gritty of the 120 days of the statute that's allowable for interim U.S. attorneys,
Right.
the idea of confirmation. But it's always important to see the big picture. Why were the framers requiring confirmation by the Senate to roles like this? And it's to ensure that, people were vetted, that they knew how dangerous prosecutors were in particular. And they didn't want a king who was able to just, wipe aside their opponents. And so that's really what we're talking about when we talk about this nitty-gritty here.
Well, let's talk about the founders and what they wanted, and let's talk about following laws, because last week we saw a group of six lawmakers, Senators Mark Kelly and Alyssa Slotkin, Representatives Chris Deluzio, Maggie Goodlander, Chrissy Houlihan, Jason Crow. They put out this video. They're all U.S. military veterans or CIA veterans to gently remind the troops, hey, don't commit war crimes. we talked about it already. They said, we know you are under enormous stress and pressure right now. The administration
Yeah.
is pitting our uniformed military and intelligence community professionals against American citizens like you, like us. You all swore an oath to protect and defend the Constitution. Now, obviously, the story's been very, very covered. The president woke up, opened his phone, and declared that these six Democrats were committing seditious behavior punishable by death. He reposted 16 separate posts calling for these veterans to be murdered. 16, Corey.
Mm.
16. So now Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Jägermeister, a man who is not remotely qualified for his job, has tried to launch a probe this
Secretary.
week that could recall Senator Mark Kelly, hero and astronaut and husband of Gabby Giffords, and the guy that I thought Kamala Harris was going to ask to be her running mate. He could now recall Senator Mark Kelly for active duty and
Wow.
court-martial him for the crime of reminding troops to not break the law. Corey, this is so stupid it grieves me we have to spend
Yeah.
time on it, but it's also fascinating. Is there any basis whatsoever for this investigation? Because to my view, it just looks like Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth are really trying to make Mark Kelly president in 2028.
Yeah, I think that is hopefully going to be the reaction, and let's try to make that happen, and partly by revealing this as the horrible authoritarian power grab that it is. Of course, this is part of the same theme of trying to destroy our basic system of government. And what's more basic in our system of government than the idea that unlawful orders to the military are illegal and shouldn't be
Right?
followed? By definition, that is the idea. And yet you have this warped president and this warped Secretary of Defense who have a totally different idea, which is that obedience to the president, period, is all that matters, no matter if the order is illegal or, as you said, a war crime or not. And all you have are individuals, including a member of the Senate, saying, no, you don't have to obey an order to commit a war crime. And of course, this isn't abstract as they're blowing up boats
Oh, it's so
without any due process.
controversial.
But here, here's what scares me, John. And that one of the things we're always trying to do on the podcast is call out injustice, call out threats to democracy, but also talk in real terms about how these threats might become real. And so we talked about the fact that, yes, these prosecutions of Comey and James, as awful as they are, might continue. And there are ways, I hope not. I pointed out how I hope not. And that's true here, too. I would hope nothing could come of this. But here's the thing. This strategy of trying to recall the senator and essentially court-martial him at least raises the question, which is that there's no question that for a civilian, you have a First Amendment right to your opinion, and you certainly have a right to say what the actual truth is, that you have an entitlement to that you shouldn't obey an unlawful order.
Hmm.
That's just basic civics 101. But military officials have less rights under the freedom of speech under the First Amendments than civilians do, and so. I don't think anything will come of this, but once we're in the world of military justice, things can happen that really are outside. Now, let's add to this fact that this is a sitting U.S. senator. So this isn't just an attack
Right.
on citizens. It's an attack on one of our main institutions, on the U.S. Senate. But even here, and, I'll say a tiny bit, which is that I'm filming now a documentary version of my book, The Presidents and the People. And one of the scenes that's so relevant is that we were in Philadelphia on the floor of what was the House of Representatives, beautifully preserved. And what I talk about in that scene, and I'll mention it now too, is that there was a sitting congressman in 1798, Matthew Lyons, who criticized the president, who was prosecuted for it, and in fact ran from prison and was re-elected congressman from Vermont. So it sounds insane, but yes, we've seen these kind of prosecutions in political history, even of a sitting congressman. That's not unprecedented. Eugene Debs ran for president, was
That's right.
prosecuted, ran from prison for being prosecuted again for his speech. These weren't people who committed crimes; they were just speaking out, and that's what's going on here too. So it's horrible, it's dangerous, but we've seen these assaults on democracy before. We've gotten through them in the long term by fighting back, as you said, by politics, for instance, by elevating the person attacked. But could he get away with it in the short term? It's not unheard of.
So, I mean, here's the thing. I'm with you all the way. This Pete Hegseth, this Fox News prompter monkey going after Mark Kelly. This is like a mall cop trying to arrest Captain America for loitering, right? But
And
Senator
can I just
Kelly,
point out to the listeners
please.
and to you, which is that, of course, Pete Hegseth was an undergrad at Princeton University when I was a graduate student, and one of my duties was to teach sections or precept, as Princeton calls it. And I know that I taught as a preceptor for a professor that Hegseth loved because he did a whole Fox News story about him. And I'm putting it at 85% that I was his TA, his
Yeah,
preceptor.
you've got to let go of that shame, Corey.
I don't know. This is my fault.
You've
I
got
feel
to,
like.
you're never going to heal, Professor, unless you
Can I
can let
just
go
tell
of
you the
that
name of
shame.
the class that Pete
Please.
Hegseth taught that I was teaching with this professor? Civil liberties.
Wow, how woke. Well, now they'll want to impeach him. I mean, Senator Kelly, I think, framed this really well, Corey. He said that Trump has now declared loyalty to the Constitution to be punishable by death, based on Donald Trump's posts calling Democrats
Mm,
traitors who should be executed. But I mean, to the actual points that these veterans made originally, we know these boat strikes are extrajudicial killings. I mean, they had
yep.
two survivors and they repatriated them to their home countries. So either they're innocent or we're letting these dangerous narco terrorists go. And that was met with pushback. That was overruled by Pam Bondi, the first ever attorney general made entirely of orange plastic. While this is going on, Trump is trying to get the military to invade more American cities because this is important. He believes illegal orders are just
Mhm.
orders Democrats don't like. I mean, the guy does think the Constitution is like a Cheesecake Factory menu. There's too many words, it needs more pictures. But I mean, sending troops into polling stations. Jason Crow listed the previously threatened illegal orders by Trump, sending troops into polling stations, shooting peaceful protesters, killing terrorist families. I mean,
Right.
all the Kelly video did, it's just Congress doing its duty to warn the military about unlawful orders. How dangerous do you think is the president's stochastic terrorism rhetoric in constitutional terms?
I think it's enormously dangerous. And going way back to the Obama administration, the way you and I met, I don't know if you even remember this, John, but I wrote a piece for Politico, and it was called simply Trump versus the Constitution, colon, a guide. This is when he was running in 2016. And I tried to say, to America, the piece did get a lot of attention, and it led to our friendship and collaboration, that if you look at each of these things individually, they're bad. But when you add them up, and I'll just mention some of them, the promise to torture the families of suspected terrorists,
That's
not the
it.
terrorists themselves,
That's
the
it.
promise to shut down the libel laws, meaning to make it possible to get rid of any protection, First Amendment protection, and to allow libel law to be a way of a sword to shut down dissent. And we could keep going. The promise of a total and complete shutdown of Muslim immigration into the United States that became the travel ban. If you look at any of these one things individually, they're bad. But if you add them up, they amount to a promise to destroy not just democracy, but the rule of law. And that's, you see in this dialogue, he has no appreciation for the idea that he is not above the law. He thinks he is above the law the way an absolute monarch would, not even a constitutional monarch, but Louis the XIV or some tyrant. And the idea that there could be some limit from something called the law. The law is something to evade for Trump. Think of it, in terms of real estate. You need your Roy Cohn, who's going to come into
Yeah.
court and just, batter the judge, batter the opposition. It's just a weapon. It's not something that constrains you. And yet, here we are. This is how Trump sees the world, and he is president. It's not any office. And just, to tie the stories together, it's so important to do this. Why is he bringing prosecutions against his political opponents? How can he do that? Well, it's because he essentially controls the Department of Justice, including the
Of
U.S.
course.
attorneys. And so,
Which
we
brings us
could,
back to disbarment, Pammy. Go on,
we
Corey.
hope
Sorry.
so. We can fight
Hmm.
back, in all of these cases. But it is dangerous, all of it, because of his assault on, again, not just the Constitution, not just democracy, but the very idea that he's constrained by law. That is what's so scary about this moment. It sums it all up to me.
No, absolutely. And again, I mean, I think it's really more of a trial balloon. I mean, they know how stupid this makes them look historically. And there's
Right.
tons of active duty and retired military who are going to look at this and realize how profoundly dishonest the White House is being. I mean, just lies building on lies. Like they've had to lie about it in right-wing media on
Right.
Fox. They've constantly said, "Oh, they were telling troops to disobey the president." No, they were telling troops to follow the
Right.
law. But before we get to the
That's a
break, I
harder
mean,
concept to understand, though, than a lot
oh,
of
I know.
people are willing to, not just
Well,
um,
authoritarianism doesn't want you to follow the law.
exactly.
Authoritarianism wants
And
you to
there are
follow the strong
authoritarian,
man.
right. And there aren't just authoritarians in power, there are authoritarian personalities who want to obey. And Fox News is encouraging that. And people who don't see the world in terms of principles or the rule of law, who think that the guy is in charge, he's the leader, bow down to him. And Trump, of course, often says that in his admiration for dictators. That's my worry, that the chilling effect here is severe, and that military who are listening to all of this, who might find themselves on the streets being asked to fire on civilians, it's a confusing thing to face an order like that. Do you disobey, which the law would require, and not just firing willy-nilly on civilians, no question. But the president said to do it, and
I
that's
guess, yeah,
the worry. They
I
might
don't
go
find it
along, some of them.
I don't find it confusing, Professor. I think the
It
ones who
shouldn't
choose
be.
to follow the
It's not for
law
you and me, but
The
it
ones
is
who choose to
for
follow the
some
law will
people.
follow the law, and the ones who want to abuse and hurt people because
Right.
will do it if the president gives them the license to do it. Do you
Yeah.
expect us to see more of these really stupid, counterproductive, selective investigations from this White House? I mean, probing the critics and just ignoring the loyalists.
They're going to try, and they're going to try to keep putting in their loyalists because this was their lesson from Trump 1.0. They saw that people who have minimum integrity are not who they want in these positions of power. And that's why you have at the top of the Justice Department, let's not forget, she's there. Pam Bondi is not a person of integrity. She's not somebody who, to say the least, who has anything but loyalty for this president. And that isn't, she is confirmed. She's not interim. And that's a powerful position to have a pure loyalist in because, it's complicated, but essentially all the U.S. attorneys work for the Department of Justice. And there are maneuvers that she can take herself to make these prosecutions happen if they have trouble getting people in these positions. And, there isn't a question about her legal appointment. That's what's so scary.
Okay, we got to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to talk to you about the death of Doge and the birth of the Trump Zohran Mamdani love fest. My God, I bet Eric and Don Jr. wish he talked that nicely about them just once. We'll be back in just a moment. This is The Oath and the Office. Welcome back to The Oath and the Office. I'm John Fugelsang. So let's go back, Professor Brettschneider, through the mists of time to an ancient land called early 2025 when Elon Musk, a man who is truly a debit to his race, was allowed to become the third worst president of my lifetime after Dick Cheney, Vladimir Putin, and Elon Musk. And we had the Department of Government Efficiency, which didn't even have an actual office. And it was really just in charge of trying to decimate the civil service to shave a few dollars off the budget to give it away to rich guys in a tax cut. Trump has disbanded Doge 8 months after its charter. And this might be the first time in history a president has disbanded an office that may not have actually existed. Corey, was it just a grift with stationery? I mean, what does this confusion tell us about the governance structure or lack thereof inside this administration?
Well, it helps them to essentially wipe it away entirely because there were so many lawsuits about their actions being illegal. Similar actually to our first story about whether this was a legal appointment, because if he was a principal officer, Elon Musk, in charge of, what arguably was one of the most important agencies at the time, just based on what they were doing, going on dismantling the entire federal government or a lot of it, including USAID, which resulted in horrible starvation and consequences for people around the world. That if he was such an important figure, the Constitution requires that he would have to be confirmed by the Senate. So who was this
Right?
guy? And yet, of course, he was not and likely couldn't have been. And now all these lawsuits, all these claims are just disappearing. And how do you do that? You claim it doesn't exist anymore, maybe that it never existed. And of course it did. Part of the dynamic too is that you have in the head of Project 2025, Russell Vought, who we've talked about, somebody who wanted to accomplish the same goals as Musk, but he wanted to do it
Hmm.
legally and methodically in a way that would last. And in a way, even though we've gotten rid of this, wild character, Elon Musk, dangerous, reckless, more dangerous is the person who understands how government works. And so I think he's very happy, Vote, to be done with Musk. And, now his vision of Project 2025 of really permanently dismantling so much of the federal government might come to pass. And here's the worry: they might do it in a way that would get upheld in court. So on the one hand, I'm glad to be done with the Doge chapter. It was so reckless. And yet I'm very worried about what's coming next.
Yeah, me too. I mean, in looking at this, what are the constitutional implications when the executive branch is allowed to create entities that have no transparency, no oversight, and in this case, seemingly no paperwork? This was just a bunch of douchebags running roughshod over the government.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are dangers in both. The danger of Musk and Doge was that they were, for example, they found an office in the Treasury Department that controlled a lot of the funding. Now, the funding decisions of allocation or withdrawal are supposed to come from Congress. Congress, and you've heard this phrase often, has the power of the purse.
Hmm.
But Musk was like, well, I'm going to hack this. I'm going to hack the US government. How do I do that? Where is the actual purse? Okay, it's in this office. And then, let's break in there. Let's shut off the funds. So all of that is so highly illegal, highly unconstitutional. And that was part of the danger, that they were trying to set up a dictatorship in this really ad hoc, willy-nilly, dangerous way, in the sort of language of Silicon Valley of breaking everything and starting again.
Yeah.
And yet here's what's, to me, equally dangerous, maybe worse, is a constitutional savvy person like Russell Vought, who understands the mechanisms of how to actually accomplish the same goals, maybe in a slower way, but that will be upheld in court and will be slower. And, Vought, for instance, wants to challenge a lot of the legislation that was passed after Nixon that banned impoundment. The
Right.
it banned the president from saying, "I'm just not going to spend these funds." Vought thinks those are unconstitutional. So he's looking for instances where he can tee up issues where the Supreme Court is going to enable essentially the same thing that Musk wanted to do, to destroy the power of Congress, to
Right.
aggrandize the president's power. And he might get away with it because he knows what he's doing. And if it's
Well, but
not
it seems
Vought, it's
it,
his allies.
but it seems like they've already gotten away with it under Elon's messy system. I mean, I'm not sure this is simply chaos or if it doesn't fit in quite neatly, Corey, with the larger theme of Donald Trump creating shadow authority outside of normal legal challenges. I
Yeah,
mean,
I mean, yes.
none of these people are getting their jobs back, right?
Yes.
Like the fact that, oh, Doge didn't really exist. Well, that doesn't render null and void all the damage they did and all the career civil servants who lost their livelihoods.
I think that's right. And, that's a good way to put it, that the recklessness sticks. Now, the question is, how do you continue to do it? Well, they're not going to do it in this willy-nilly attack dog way, because there were a number of suits against Musk himself. And a lot of them focused on the question of whether or not he was lawfully appointed. That might have led to injunctions. It might have led to a Supreme Court decision ultimately against a lot of what they were doing. But the fact that so much has been done already, and there isn't a way to attack it by attacking Doge, now step in not people of, I wouldn't call them integrity, but people who know what they're doing, and the legal challenges are become much harder. So yes, that chaos and the immediacy of it, the acting followed by getting rid of all the chaos agents, that's part of the danger. Maybe that's the way to put it, that they will get away with it, partly because they've been wiped away. So there's sort of madness in the chaos that it is working for them. And, as much as we can talk about instances where we're fighting back and winning, I don't want to lose sight of the point that you made, which is we're not going to put back USAID. We're not going to put back this infrastructure. They're not going to start obeying the role of Congress when it comes to allocation. The shutdown was an attempt to do that, but now that that's
Yeah.
over, it's very hard to think about how we're going to fight back.
So let's talk then about the feel-good story of the month. No, not the Epstein files being released. Not Marjorie Taylor Greene leaving. Donald Trump walked into the Oval Office to meet with Zohran Mamdani, mayor-elect of New York. He was all ready to scream, "Foreign Muslim jihadist communist." And instead, he walked out, Professor, saying, "This is my special little rational boy. I love him." I want to talk to you about what we witnessed with Donald Trump and the flattery machine. It was like The Bachelor, and Trump gave Zohran the final rose before they even went on camera. This guy was so giggly, Corey. He was so thirsty. He was looking like he was trying to join Zohran's fan club. And I mean, he was like, "You mean someone younger and more popular who New Yorkers like? And he's the only man in this room who's not a kiss ass? Is this love?" Like the MAGA folks had no objections to seeing Donald Trump with the terrorist leader of Syria. They had no problem seeing Donald Trump bury his face in the lap of murderer Mohammed bin Salman. Oh, but the nice liberal Muslim, that's who we were told. It's going to be a showdown. We were sold this by Fox News. It's going to be a showdown in the Oval Office. And then the whole thing shows up, and Zohran doesn't compromise a single value. He didn't soften any stances. He sat there like, "Yes, you're a dictator. Yes, Gaza is genocide. Yes, working people matter." And Trump's like, "It's okay. You can call me fascist. It's okay." Corey, I'm still trying to get over this. I mean, on a one level, I'm not totally surprised. It makes a lot of sense. Zohran knows how to charm people. And Donald Trump's ethnic group, I've always said, is celebrity. If you're famous, he'll act like
Yeah.
you're one of his. But after all the months of spreading racist, bigoted lies about this guy, and then meeting him and offering him support right away, and essentially nuking Elise Stefanik's gubernatorial campaign, which is all based on this guy's a crazy jihadist. What does this pattern reveal to you, Professor, about the nature of this president's authoritarian style? Because it's
Well,
luster, it's threat, and then it's total collapse if you give me a cookie.
yeah, what a great characterization and one of the bizarre moments of this wild point in American history. I'll start with just the question of the president's ideology. You know, he, I think, is an authoritarian when it comes to his personality, and critics and those who go after him, like a true authoritarian, he wants to slap them down. That's what's going on in our two main stories for today, the prosecution of James and Comey, and also this idea that somehow saying don't follow illegal orders is a violation of his power. All those speak to an authoritarian personality. But when it comes to ideology, ideas, you know, he's not sophisticated. And so when he sees somebody who's a skillful politician who's saying things that to him sort of sound like what he's saying, and let's not forget the kind of not just charm but the sophistication of Mamdani, how he brought this out of him. He said, for instance, and must have done this in the private meeting too, that he went out in New York and talked to voters who voted for Trump, and they also voted for me. And Trump is like, "Oh, this
Right.
guy, the people who like me like this guy." You know, that's the level and the mentality that he's thinking on. So, you know, ideological socialism, that matters less to him than does this guy like me or not. And then, you know, he talked about
I
their
think you're
common
right.
goals of making the cost of living, and then real estate. You know, this president, and I have one more thing to add, but real estate speaks to him. That's his language. He went in there and talked about the need for more housing. Maybe the Trump organization might be involved in that. I'm sure he didn't offer it, but in Trump's
Oh,
mind, that's how
no,
he's
but
thinking.
that's so you heard the
Yep.
Zoran says, "Oh, more housing," and instantly, ka-ching, ka-ching. Can I get a taste? Can I get
Right.
a taste?
Can
Right
I get a
away, he
taste?
goes there.
Maybe. So all these are tempting him. And now I watched the full 30 minutes, I should say, which I recommend to people because it is an amazing piece of political theater. But at one point, Trump said, and I've mentioned this, I grew up, as you know, around New York politics. And one thing that he says that really just brings it out, and I remember Trump, of course, from the 1980s as a kid, is that really what he wanted was to be mayor of New York City. What a great job that was. I think
Or
the only
king, or
reason
king
what
of New York City, king of New York City,
he
maybe.
was
He
he
didn't
was
want to
never
work, Corey. He didn't want to do the work.
he was never going to win that election. And so what's the next best thing, much to the danger of the world and all of us? It's president of the United States. So here's a guy who he could be friends with, who he admires, who's also good at this. And he's got the job that he wants. So that I think all these sort of added up to this weird love fest. And just to point out, if people haven't seen it, some of the strange things that happen. Trump surrounds himself with a gaggle of acolytes. These aren't real reporters. They're, you know,
Correct.
from white supremacist or far right,
All of
you
them.
know, websites. And they're saying things to the mayor-elect, things like, "Why did you fly here rather than take the train?" And Trump himself had to jump in. He's like, he's very busy, and it's a lot shorter to fly. So he's just jumping into all this. I mean, that
He's
was
helping him
among the
out.
weird.
Yeah. I
And
mean,
then and
and
then
and he's
he
smiling at him. I've never seen him smile at Eric. Never seen him smile at Eric. But
or
oh, he's
Don
going to adopt this kid. And
or Don.
meanwhile,
Yeah, he's
Elise
good boy.
Stefanik's traipsing around upstate New York, going, "Mamdani's a jihadist," and Trump's like, "No, he's really rational." I mean, we saw him at a gay bar the night before Election Day. What kind of jihadist is that, for God's sakes? But let me ask you this,
How about the
Professor.
fascist point, John? I mean, is that not
It's
our
great.
favorite point? Where he says
It's
to
great when
him,
they.
well, one of the gaggle of these acolytes, of these kiss up people that Trump surrounded himself with in the Oval Office, says, "Well, didn't you call Trump a fascist?" And then Trump pauses for a second and says, "You know, it's okay."
Yeah, it's okay.
Essentially,
You
you
can
can
call me a
call me
fascist.
that. Amazing.
Yeah, it's all a game to him. But
Mm,
I got to ask, Professor, this guy was last week threatening to withhold federal funding to New York City. I mean, he was threatening if Mamdani was elected, that he as
right.
president would cut off federal funds to the city that gives the federal government so much more than it takes back. Is threatening to withhold federal funds from cities based on election outcomes you don't like legal, Corey? Is that even remotely constitutional? Like, I don't think anyone around him was taking anything he said seriously, and certainly Mamdani wasn't.
Well, John, this is one of the real, it fits our theme, and I wish I could answer in a way that said, yes, obviously the Supreme Court would stop that. They would say it's a First Amendment right or an abuse of the coercive action under the court's precedents. But the truth is that under a case called Dole versus South Dakota, and there are a number of others, the power of the federal government to use incentives and disincentives, including the revocation of federal funds, is a power of the federal government and possibly of the president. And now there's supposed to be limits to that have to do with the fund. It can't be all funds. But we saw him starting to do this in the first term, and he's threatening to do it again. And yes, the court might regard it not as the same as coercing somebody you disagree with. I think that those are First Amendment violations, but as the prerogative of the president to give or withdraw money. And that is a very real danger that he might do that to New York. And the fact that they're getting along and saying that he's not likely to do it. Same with troops. So the president can't commandeer a local police station. All of these, by the way, are under the umbrella of the constitutional doctrine of federalism. Certain powers are given to the federal government, including the spending
Right.
power. And then some are reserved to the states. So that's always what we're talking about. But one of those powers, the spending power, might be used to withdraw funds. So there are limits. You can't just go to the New York police force and take it over if you're the president of the United States, as much as he'd want to. But what can you do? You can build up agencies under your control, like ICE, and use them as a kind of military force and send them in. And as we've often discussed, you could potentially use the military or commandeer under the Insurrection Act, the National Guard, not the police. All
Right.
of those are possible. And so that's why when we talk about this, I wish I could say, he can't do that. What a great show. I would like to show more. If every time you said, can he do that? I said, no, he can't do that. He can't do that. But that's not the reality of how it works. We have a system in which the president is enormously powerful, where courts have enabled him, where legislation has passed on powers. The Insurrection Act is like that to the federal government. And that's why this is such a frightening moment. Yes, if he didn't like Mamdani, if it didn't go well, we might be in a very different world in New York right now.
Yeah. Well, right before the election, a friend of the pod, Jake Tapper, was talking to Trump's advisor, Kevin Hassett, on CNN. And he asked him about, Trump threatening to withhold federal funding. Was it all bluster? He didn't mean it. Let me quote Kevin Hassett directly. Top economic advisor. He said, "Well, it feels like he doesn't mean it now. It feels like he doesn't mean it now." This policy is based on vibes, Corey. I mean, not really on a set policy or ideology. How dangerous should we regard it when federal power appears to be wielded according to the personal mood swings of someone
Yeah, I
who
think,
could be
as we
suffering from decades of untreated syphilis, I should point out, please.
I mean, I think that as much as it was fun to watch this, to watch Mamdani as a skillful politician, weave around this wildly dangerous, erratic president, we also have to recognize the fact that part of why it felt so good is because with all that power that I just talked about is the ability to inflict harm. And so his mood swings are so
That's it.
frightening. Let me just illustrate this. This won't make people feel more secure. It will make you feel less, but it's the reality. During Nixon's the end of his term, right before he resigned, he was drinking a lot, and the Secretary
Yes.
of Defense was very worried about this because the power to launch a nuclear weapon doesn't rest with Congress. It doesn't rest with the Secretary of Defense. It rests with the president. And so illegally, the Secretary of Defense said to those in the launch sequence, basically in the command and control, I don't care what the law is. If he calls you to try to launch a nuclear weapon, call me, because he was drinking so much and acting so erratically. That is a dramatic symbol of
Oh,
what we're
Pete
dealing with.
Hegseth is going to be furious. Pete Hegseth is going to hit the roof when he hears about this someday, Corey.
The idea that Pete Hegseth is going to save us too, in the way that the defense secretary during Nixon might have, I don't think so.
Wow.
So that just,
I
that's the reality. We talked about this with Ted Lieu. I highly recommend, if we have new listeners, to go back and listen to that. That's why that first strike bill, that, as he calls it, is so important, that he's been a champion of for a long time, to really try to reset the powers of the president so the president can't launch, because they're drunk, for instance, a nuclear attack.
And let's also point out Donald Trump's various threats about federal funding as a political weapon. We got to take a very short break. We'll be back in just a moment to try to tie all this together with The Oath and the Office. Don't go away. Welcome back to The Oath and the Office. I'm John Fugelsang. Professor Corey Brettschneider is with me. Corey, looking at all the stories we've talked about today, I mean the fake prosecutors, the illegal investigations, disappearing agencies, funding threats. Are we just witnessing an administration testing how far it can go in dismantling constitutional constraints? I mean, they don't really seem to have any grand plan to help people.
I think, that's the reality of where we are, that he has told us many times who he is. And when he says he admires dictators, he wants his people to obey, he means it. And in the first term, he was blocked so often by civil servants, by public officials. But coming back now with this playbook of loyalty over the law, the theme of today, I am still worried. I wish I could say we're winning. He's trying to destroy the Constitution, and he's facing the consequences. And of course, in each moment there is hope. There's the senator from Arizona talking about don't obey illegal orders, the judge stopping the prosecutions. But that's not the end of the story. It's still, people are resisting. They're fighting back. That's what we all have to do. Of course, you know how excited and energized I was by the No Kings rally. But the fact is, none of
Yes.
those stories are at the end. So yes, those prosecutions of both Comey and James could continue. Yes, he may well issue illegal orders. He likely has been doing so already and will continue to do so. And the horrific thing is, as much as you and I and our audience knows that's wrong not to do it, people on the ground in the military very well might follow them, because the easier thing to do, rather than to think about the difficult question of, is this an illegal order? Or maybe the not so difficult question, resisting the order from the president is hard. The military is set up as a command and control organization. Orders, the default is to follow them. The harder question under our law is, what do you do when the orders are illegal? That is, at minimum, going to feel difficult in the moment. So that's why this is such a dangerous period in our history, and continues to be so.
I mean, I hate to ask a dumb question, but moving forward in the next 3 years of this lame duck presidency, what should Americans understand about the difference between normal political conflict, like we all grew up with, and authoritarian abuse of state power? Like, we have to have this tutorial, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say too, John, that I'm teaching freshmen through seniors at Brown this year, as always. And they have all really grown up with this politics. They can't really remember. They remember the Biden period, but it was a break between these two presidencies. So to them, and this is awful to realize, as much as so many of our listeners realize how different it is from a politics that was much more normal, this is their normal, this attack on democracy. It's a chilling idea. And when you try to explain to some of them, even those who are more progressive minded, how off this is, that's not really how they see it. They see the whole system as dangerously authoritarian, as complicit in this man's prejudice, in his civil rights violations, in his attack on the rule of law. And, that's a reality check, that this has been with us for so long that it doesn't seem normal to some of our listeners and really almost all of my students.
So in this age, let me close it with this, Corey. I mean, we're in this era where obedience to the Constitution should not just be allowed, but expected. And we all seem to have decided, well, we're in the middle of this stress test. We'll give it 3 years and then respect the Constitution again. I mean, there's no fear of prosecution, right? For any of these crimes or constitutional norms being shattered. What tools are still left? The courts, the Congress, state officials, civil society to resist these abuses. It's just going to come down to all of us, right? Being informed and hoping that that the courts hold.
Yes, I mean there are, actors who are fighting back. You have this judge who did dismiss this case on the grounds, as she should have, that this was an illegal appointment. We have the No Kings rally. We have senators, like the senator from Arizona, sticking up and saying what's right. But the reality is we are in a moment in which the power rests with a wannabe authoritarian. And so these are acts of resistance. But they're acts that are leading to something, which is the midterms and the next presidential election. And hopefully they're also leading to what didn't happen during the Biden administration, a way through legislation to correct the risk of abuse. We've got to think not just about Trump, but about the next president that might try an authoritarian takeover of the United States. And in the same way that after Nixon, we had a series of laws that did protect us, including the Independent Counsel Act, the Emergencies Act, laws that we can go into a future episode, and that I did get
Yeah.
to talk to actually about with Ted Lieu about, and he sees this as part of his mission. It was why he was such an important guest for us. And when we have Sheldon Whitehouse next week, we'll talk to him about it. But we need to restructure our government through legislation that reins in the risk of a dangerous president, not just to win an election. That is part of it, of course, but to really fix the system.
Professor Corey Brettschneider, I want to thank you again, and I want to thank all of our listeners. I want to remind everybody to please subscribe and give us a good review and share our episodes. And hey, check out the YouTube page as well. And send us your letters, right, Corey? We read them on the air.
Yes, we've every few episodes, we're taking questions, and you can write to me at corey.brettschneider@gmail.com. I'm reading them. I'm collecting them, and in a couple weeks, we'll take a bunch of them together. So keep sending them in. Of course, subscribe on Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. We're on Spotify and really all the audio podcasts. And yes, our YouTube is really taking off. So subscribe there, watch us, not just listen to us. And finally, I'll mention if you're on Substack, we have a weekly newsletter that summarizes the discussion or discussion with guests. And has links to articles and also sometimes previews what's about to come out, including, again, Senator Whitehouse next week from Rhode Island, an amazing person fighting back against Trump.
Well, thank you so much, Professor. I want to wish everybody a very happy Thanksgiving, and I want to wish everybody a very happy Ukraine surrender deal, if that's what you're rooting for. We got to talk about that next week, Corey, because my God, did you read this surrender agreement? This thing was so Russian. I think it hacked the DNC. So we'll get to that next week. But in the meantime, thank you to Wendy and Beowulf and everyone else who helps bring us the oath and the office.
And I'm going to add just one more thank you to our audience, and also, of course, best wishes for a happy Thanksgiving.